All right, global government. And so we kind of saw this coming, right? We looked at the League of Nations when we studied World War One. We talked about United Nations a little bit. We talked about NATO, how NATO was formed. And so we're going to talk about a man named Samuel P. Huntington. He was a professor of political science at Harvard, and he wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations and the Making of the World Order. So I'm going to minimize myself so you can see the whole screen and we'll get going here. So, Huntington's major argument was that cultural identities, antagonisms, and affiliations will not only play a role, but a major role in the relations between the states. So, here's a photo of him. And so basically, he wrote this article. Remember, the Cold War ended in 91. And so at the time, a lot of the scholars, the political scholars of the day, were looking at where is the next giant conflict going to come from? What's going to cause World War III? Everybody is sort of speculating about that. They've been speculating about that since World War I ended, right? And so this particular article that Huntington wrote got a lot of attention. And he makes five major claims in this book. And so this is not really a teaching per se. This is more when I teach my NC classes, we have a discussion on this. Each one of these arguments that he makes, it's debatable. And so I like to debate with my students to find out, what do you think about these things? If you wanted to write your final paper on this particular topic and evaluate Huntington's arguments, I think that would also make a very good assignment. I would be open if you want to do that. So he says that cultural identities, antagonisms, and affiliations will play not only a role, but a major role in relations between the states. Now, remember, states doesn't mean the United States, because in political science, the term state is any entity that governs itself. So France is a state, England is a state, China is a state, and we have the United States, which are a bunch of little states all united under one government. That's what that actually means. And so the idea here is that the world is going to become regionalized, he says. So this is 93. Take yourself, back to 93. I was like in high school in 93, not really thinking about all this stuff back then. But, in 93, what's going to be the next major thing that comes up? Well, the world's going to be regionalized. Cultures are going to clash. Clash of Civilizations is the title of the book. And that's going to be where the next problem comes from. So he says, for the first time in history, global politics is both multipolar and multi civilizational. Modernization is distinct from westernization, and it's producing neither a universal civilization in any meaningful sense, nor the westernization of non Western societies. So, in other words, we're still very unique, very different. You don't have, in terms of globalization, you don't have one overarching culture, one overarching unifier of all of these countries, right? And so the balance of power among civilizations is shifting, he says. The West is declining in relative influence. Asian civilizations are expanding their economic, military, and political strength. Islam is exploding demographically with destabilizing consequences for Muslim countries and their neighbors. And non Western civilizations generally are reaffirming the value of their own cultures. So, would you agree with this statement? And again, I wish we were in the NC class, because I always get some interesting thoughts on this. Some people agree on some of these statements. Others will say, well, maybe not so much, or this is not an overarching truth. But I do think we see some of these things. I'm not sure I would say the West is declining. If you're going to ask me personally what I think about this, I think the West is gaining influence in a lot of ways. I think that Asian civilizations are expanding. They are, yes, in terms of economic, military, and political strength. I mean, look at each one and kind of see where they're at. Islam is exploding. Well, and you look at what's going on in the Middle East right now, right? Is the West reaffirming our own culture in some ways? Yes, and in some ways, maybe not. There's a lot of pushback against some of that right now. And so, yeah, so kind of evaluate that. He goes on to say a civilization is based on a world order is emerging. Societies sharing cultural affinities cooperate with each other. Their efforts to shift societies from one civilization to another are unsuccessful, and countries group themselves around the lead or core states of their civilization. So, is this what we see? I think globalization is a very real thing, right? But how is it actually playing out? What's the method? Is it more um, diplomatic in nature than militarily based? And what about bureaucracy? I think that's a very important aspect of it. So, kind of thinking about those things as well. Now, the West's universalist pretensions increasingly bring it into conflict with other civilizations, most seriously with Islam and China. At the local level, fault line wars, largely between Muslims and non Muslims, generate kin country rallying, in quotes, the threat of broader escalation and hence efforts by core states to halt these wars. The survival of the West depends on Americans reaffirming their Western identity and Westerners accepting their civilization as unique, not universal, and uniting to renew and preserve it against challenges from non Western societies. Avoidance of a global war of civilizations depends on world leaders accepting and cooperating to maintain the multi civilizational character of global politics. So, um, global polarization. So, the author argues that during most of human existence, contacts between civilizations were intermittent or non existent. Then, with the beginning of the modern era, which is about AD 1500, that would be the age of exploration, you have this new two-dimensional global political structure. Which was in we studied Atlantic history, and this is true in many ways. You have all of a sudden folks going across the ocean. They're making contact with people they've never seen before. You have the Columbian Exchange, which is where named for Columbus, where the Europeans brought certain things over to the Americas that weren't there before, and same the Americas gifted the Europeans certain things, which involves horses, food, diseases. I mean, all kinds of things that were exchanged between these two. And that created the first semblance of global society as we know it today. And as technology has developed, we have become more globally connected than ever before. And even now, we have, you can translate a language with the click of a button. So we have overcome language barriers in some very profound ways. And which, and that was all part of the early, they had to learn the language, but language barriers were overcome. We found things like the Rosetta Stone, and that helped us to calculate languages. So, all kinds of technologies and human abilities have lent themselves to these things. So, in this new world, local politics is the politics of ethnicity. Global politics is the politics of civilizations. And again, this is an argument. All of these slides are arguments from the author that, if we were in an NC class, we would be evaluating these questions, these statements. Are these true? What is local politics? Right? Is it really the politics of ethnicity? What is global politics? Is it really the politics of civilizations? The rivalry of superpowers is replaced by the clash of civilizations, he says, which is the name of the book. He says that states are and will remain dominant entities in world affairs. They maintain armies, conduct diplomacy, negotiate treaties, fight wars, control international organizations, influence, and in considerable measure shape production and commerce. Now, while states remain the primary actors in world affairs, they are suffering a loss of sovereignty. International institutions now assert the right to judge and to constrain what states do in their own territory. And I think we spoke about this a few weeks ago in one of my lectures. I talked about the billiard ball state. If you've played pool, I was actually just playing pool on Saturday night. Lots of fun. But if you play pool, you know that the cue ball, is used to hit all these other balls into the pockets. And the idea is that they have to have a very hard exterior. Otherwise, they're going to shatter. when they're hit, right? And that's the idea of the billiard ball state autonomy, right? State autonomy. A strong country is going to be solid like a billiard ball when it's hit, and a weak country is going to shatter, right? And so that's the billiard ball state mentality. So how strong are our individual countries in the world today versus the global entity? Which one is the stronger of the two? And I think that's kind of where he's going with this. And it's interesting. And let me say this also. He wrote this article in 93, right? But he came back and wrote a whole book based on the article. And so this was, I want to say 2011. So in, somewhere between 93 and 2011, he developed all of these thoughts and ideas about global affairs and what this is going to look like. And again, this is one man's argument. If you look in the GHC library, you'll find there are many counter arguments to this book. And so I encourage you not just to hear Huntington's view, but to look at the other scholars who refute his views and why. That would make for an interesting paper. What does Huntington say? What do other scholars say? And what do you personally think about these things? So, in many states, including those in the developed world, regional movements exist promoting substantial autonomy or secession. State governments have, in considerable measure, lost the ability to control the flow of money in and out of their country, and they're having increasing difficulty controlling the flow of ideas, technologies, goods, and people. And so, this kind of lends itself to some research, right? You've got to figure out, well, okay, who's borrowing from whom? And where is the money coming from? Where is it going? What about technology? Is technology creating a situation where people are being guided in their thinking? And so all of a sudden, it's almost like scrolling on Facebook, right? If you're just sitting at home not doing anything, your thoughts are going to go wherever you're leading them to go. If you're on Facebook and you're scrolling, all of a sudden you have a thought in your head that you didn't have before. And where did that thought come from? Well, it came from technology, right? And so technology can very easily guide our thoughts in some profound ways. And can that determine the way a country and the way political structure goes? And what does that look like on the local level, the state level, the federal level, and the global level? So kind of like, compartmentalizing all that, but then putting it all together as well. And so state borders, in short, have become increasingly permeable. All of these developments have led many to see the gradual end of the hard billiard ball state, which I just explained, which purportedly has been the norm since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. I'm going to skip this. So, what is the goal? Well, Huntington says the world cannot be both one and fundamentally divided between East and West or North and South, nor can the nation state be the base rock of international affairs if it is fragmenting and torn by proliferating civil strife. The world is either one, two, or at the time he said 184, now it's 195 states, or potentially an almost infinite number of tribes, ethnic groups, and nationalities. Viewing the world in terms of 7 or 8 civilizations avoids many of these difficulties. It doesn't sacrifice reality to parsimony as do 1 and 2 world paradigms, yet it also does not sacrifice parsimony to reality as the statist and chaos paradigms do. So you can look these up. I'm not going to go into what all these paradigms are. Paradigms are patterns, right? They're like patterns that are set by certain things. And so I encourage you to do some research. What is the statist and chaos paradigm, and how does that lend itself to this goal? Well, he says it provides an easily grasped and intelligible framework for understanding the world. So, patterns. Paradigms are patterns, like I said, and here's an easy way to think of it. When you start looking at patterns in history, you can somewhat predict what's going to happen in the future. For example, there's a book called The Next 100 Years. I think I posted it earlier a few weeks ago by George Friedman, and he predicted the war between Russia and Ukraine, which really isn't difficult to predict if you look at world history. He said that nations with shared cultural heritage that are on a shared border are prone to wars in the future because of just the idea of one nation having their autonomy and the other one wanting that overarching control over that region, especially with Russia and Ukraine, because Ukraine was the breadbasket of Russia. The Ukrainians are very intelligent people. They add to the Russian country in some profound ways. And so it's not surprising that Russia would want that back. Not to mention the East versus West conflict, right? And who's going to be part of NATO at this point? You've got those questions. And so, yeah, so it's pretty easy when you start looking at paradigms and paradigm shifts. You can kind of predict certain things that might occur. And it doesn't mean that they will occur, but just logically, how is this going to play out? Well, we kind of think, these things. And so here's a little blurb about the civilizationist versus statist approach. You can pause this and read through it if you want. I'm not going to go into this a whole lot other than to say a civilizational approach would encourage cooperation between Russia and Ukraine. You can kind of get where that's going. They would urge Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons, promote substantial economic assistance, and other measures would help maintain unity, independence for Ukraine. There's a contingency plan for the possible breakup of Ukraine, all kind, just kind of like stabilization. Now, the Davos Group, the term universalist civilization may refer to assumptions, values, and doctrines currently held by many people in Western civilization and by some people in other civilizations as well. And so we call this Davos culture, right? This is not anything new or secret, although there's a lot of conspiracy theories if you get on YouTube about Davos and all this. Well, it's a real thing. They meet in Davos, Switzerland. They have a meeting with the World Economic Forum. And the idea is that, they have these global goals. Climate change is one of them. They really want to see the world, reduce pollution and things like that. But you can kind of, if you get on their website, or actually they have a YouTube page, Davos YouTube page, and they have these little like 5-minute blurbs that you can watch, and it talks about all their sustainable development goals and things like that. So you can hop on there if you really want to learn more about what's going on, because this has developed even since he wrote this book. But he said at the time, Davos people control virtually all international institutions, many of the world governments, and the bulk of the world's economic and military capabilities. Davos culture, hence, is tremendously important. Worldwide, however, how many people actually share these views? Right. And so that's a statistical question. Outside the West, he said at the time, so this is like 2011, it was probably less than 50 million people, or 1% of the world's population. He went so far as to speculate it might be like 1/10 of 1% of the world's population. And so, that's the idea. And I'm sure this number has changed. I encourage you guys to look into that and kind of see exactly who supports and who doesn't. And, how many of the Western countries, how many of them support these ideas? Now, another idea is pop culture, right? So the idea exists that Western culture is advanced through patterns in pop culture around the world. Pop culture is not new; it's been around since, ancient times, really. I'm so sorry, my alarm is going off on my phone. But anyway, so the argument is neither profound nor relevant. Cultural fads have been transmitted from civilization to civilization throughout history. Think about the Beatles, right? That's not so long ago. But even in the 1800s and the 1700s, you still had pop culture. It just was more localized because you didn't have social media to spread it far and wide. But the essence of Western civilization, he says, is the Magna Carta, not the Magna Mac. The fact that non-Westerners may bite into the latter has no implications for their accepting the former. And so he goes into language. He talks about how essential language is. And again, I kind of mentioned that about language barriers. The world's language is English, according to his book. And there, like I said, Daniel Hannan, you've got all kinds of arguments about the Anglosphere. I think English is the language that they would really like to be universal. And, if you look, a lot of countries are adopting English they're incorporating it with their other languages in much the same ways that you had like Latin or Greek in the ancient world. It's, again, not so different, right? And also measurements like Arabic numbers, the metric system. Do we want to have a standard across the board for all people? It just makes life easier. Religion is another one, and we've seen that throughout history, how essential religion is to each individual culture. Well, if you have a universal language and a universal standard of measurements and all of these things, well, shouldn't you have a universal religion? Because religion can also be a very dividing factor. And so they've introduced Chrislam as one idea. You've got, Trump with the Abraham Accords. That's been a huge topic since the election. What is his foreign policy going to look like in the Middle East and all of that? And how is that going to play out? Is it going to be unifying? Is he going to pick up where he left off? And can he? I listened to a good podcast about that the other day, that it's unethical for him to pick up on that where he left off, and changes are going to have to be made. And so but all that is very fascinating. I encourage you to look into all that as well. So that's about the end of this presentation. I hope you guys found this valuable and enlightening. Again, if you want to write a paper on this, I'm more than happy to accommodate you on that. But thank you for watching to the end. I hope you guys have a great week, and please be in touch if you have any questions. Have a great day.